and welcome back to Gardening Suburbia. My name is Amanda and today we are doing sourdough starter. So back in March of this year I bought a starter for sourdough from a company called Sarver Farms, and I was making bread pretty regularly, and then once gardening season started I decided that I needed to go a little more hands-off on my sourdough starter to put more focus on my garden, and so I decided to try drying some of the sourdough starter mix. So this is basically just sourdough starter mix put on some parchment paper and left to dry out in a really thin layer to the point that it is completely dry. And so this has been stored away for a couple months now, and I'm going to go ahead and try to reconstitute it and hopefully get some sourdough starter from this. So the basic thing to start with is you do need a scale if you're going to be doing sourdough starter, just because your ingredients have to be at a certain measurement. When doing sourdough, you have to have a 1:1:1 ratio. So that is equal parts of sourdough starter, water, and flour. So the water and flour is going to be what feeds your sourdough, and they have to be at equal parts so that you get the right kind of rise out of your mixture. Right now I have a ball jar with a rubber band. This is just going to be what measures how much growth there is and what my starting mix is at, because when you go to use your sourdough starter you want it to have at least a doubling. That means that it has really good active ingredients in it. So firstly I'm going to go ahead and measure out 28 grams of my dried sourdough starter mix. So I'm going to go ahead and add in 56 grams of water. This is what's going to make it come back to life, because right now it is bone dry. So I'm going to go ahead and tare out the weight of the mix and then add in some lukewarm water. You don't want it to be too hot, just because if it gets too warm it can potentially kill the yeast in the mix. 56 on the money, and I'm just going to go ahead and give this a good mix, and then I'm going to leave this in my windowsill where there is some sunlight, and that will give it some warmth. The best practice with sourdough is to give it a nice warm place that it can grow, because it is a live organism. It does like warmth. So I'm going to leave this to sit in my windowsill for about an hour or two, or until that I see that it starts to give a little bit more of bubbles or some cloudiness. And I'm going to put a lid on this loosely so that it has room to remove any of the air, and I'm not closing in all that pressure. Alright guys, it's been about 2 hours or so. As you can see, the sourdough starter chips have kind of become like a mush. So I'm going to go ahead and give these a stir and then see where we're at. We may have to let it sit for a couple more hours, but we'll see. So it is quite warm from sitting in the sun. I'm going to go ahead and say that we need to leave it for just a little bit longer, just because these chips aren't fully dissolved yet. They are getting really close though. So I'm just going to give this a good stir and try to break up the larger pieces. I'm going to go ahead and scrape down any of the pieces so that they're actually in the water. We're getting closer. So I think this is a good sign that I dried these properly the first time around, which is awesome. It means I have more starter on hand if this one dies, or if I need to take a break from it in the future. So I'm just going to put the band and lid back on loosely and place this back in the windowsill. Alright guys, as you can see it is later in the night, so I'm going to go ahead and give this a good stir. It should be ready to add in the flour, because it does look like it has dissolved quite a bit. It's really starting to smell like sourdough starter too. Okay, so the first step is to go ahead and tear out any of the ingredients that are in here. I need to go ahead and grab flour. I like to use a mixture of different things when baking my bread, but for when adding or feeding my sourdough starter, I just use a regular all-purpose flour. So I use King Arthur's all-purpose unbleached flour. Again, I'm just putting in 28 grams of flour. Just kind of start with by the spoonful, probably about 2 spoonfuls. Get us there. And it's okay if you go over a little bit. The sourdough is not going to know the difference between a couple extra grams of flour. Alright, so I added in my flour. I'm going to go ahead and give this a good mix, and then we will be set to let it sit out and continue to do its thing. You'll need to leave this in a nice warm place, not too hot, so above 85 degrees is too hot. You could potentially cook the sourdough. and kill it. But in a warm oven, that's not on, with the light on, or on top of a fridge is good. And it's gonna take about 8 to 12 hours for this to go ahead and start to grow. So I'm gonna put this back up in my windowsill for the night, and then tomorrow we'll go ahead and check on this. Hi guys, it has been 2 days since I started this sourdough reconstitution project. I actually did have to add more water one morning just because it did look really dry after I had added the initial water and the sourdough chips that I had dried. So I added a little bit more water, waited, and then I actually fed my starter with equal parts. So I measured out how much sourdough was in my jar, and then I added equal parts of water and flour, and then I did that again. So the second time I actually discarded a lot of the sourdough starter that was in my container, leaving about this much, and then remeasured, added in that equal parts of water and flour. And this is where we're at today. So as you can see, there are a bunch of bubbles, which is a really good sign. This means that the starter is actually doing its job. It is eating away the gluten in the flour, and this is a live active starter. The best thing to know about starters is that when it's really at its most active point, there's going to be kind of like a dome shape. Right now you can't really see it because my jar is pretty dirty, but it is kind of starting to level out, which means it's time to discard a whole bunch. You can actually just leave about a tablespoon, 2 tablespoons of your starter and just go off of that, and you really don't need much. You can literally scrape this jar until there's just little bits on the edges, and then add whatever amount of flour and water to it. So I'm gonna go ahead and refeed this before I actually start using it again, just because I want it to have even more bubbles than it already does, and then we'll get on to making some bread. So here's just another view of inside the jar. You can see there's a bunch of bubbles in here. Again, a really good sign that your starter is actually active and eating away the gluten. So to start this process, I'm just gonna go ahead and scrape a whole bunch of this out and just discard it. There are a ton of recipes for making different kinds of items with the discard, because it's not necessarily just garbage. It can be used to make crackers or even just bread on its own. But I'm gonna go ahead and just discard it just because it's not as active as I want it to be, and just leave a sliver at the bottom here. All right, so I have just a little dollop of sourdough starter in at the bottom. I'm gonna go ahead and turn on my scale, and I actually usually keep a spare jar of the same size bean and not full of anything just nearby, so that I can go ahead and actually tear out my weight of the jar. You can just go ahead and take note of the weight of the jar and then just do some math. So it looks like we have 76 grams of our starter, 75. So we're gonna go ahead and add in 75 grams of flour. Again, I like to use the unbleached all-purpose flour from King Arthur. And then 75 grams of lukewarm water. You can use cold water when doing this process. It will make the growth of your sourdough starter slow down, just because it likes a warm environment. And if you do not expect to be baking bread as much, you can actually store this in your refrigerator for about a week or so, and it'll be just fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and actually scoop some of this out because I put a little too much. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tear that out, and then I'm gonna go ahead and add in the 75 grams of the flour. So as you can see while I'm stirring this, this consistency is about what you want. You want it to be kind of goopy and hold its form. If it's really loose and watery, it's about time to feed it. So now that our starter has flour and water added, I'm just gonna go ahead and move my band down to where it is out, just so I can get an idea of when it has actually doubled, because that is when it's going to be the most active, along with that bubbling effect that you get when it's like kind of domed. So again, I'm just gonna I found that putting it next to my wax melter gives it the right kind of temperature so that it like will grow. So I'm gonna put that back on my counter next to that with my jar lid on, not too tight so that the oxygen and whatnot can release from it. Number one tip, make sure that any utensils that you use for stirring or whatever when using your sourdough starter, make sure you clean them right after or put them in some nice soapy water, because if you leave this to dry, it will get so rock hard that you can't get it off. So I'm gonna put this in my sink, let it soak, and I'll see you as soon as we are making some bread.